Hello, everyone. You're listening to Speaking of Art School, an oral history project created to perpetuate the legacy and culture of the San Francisco Art Institute. I'm your host, Thomas Houston. Thanks for listening. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Thomas M. Houston, and this is episode number 12 of Speaking of Art School. And I'm a graduate from the San Francisco Art Institute, class of 1984. And today we're taking a little bit of a different turn in the spirit of SFAI. And I'm going to be speaking with Heather Spore, who is the producer of the movie Make Me Famous. It's a film about the 80s in New York, in the East Village, and the art scene there, and Edward Brezinski, who also was a student at SFAI, and Heather is going to be joining me here any moment. Brian Vincent and Heather Spore, of course.
We had a very successful screening at the Roxy last night. We're gearing up for Thursday for our 4-star run, where we will have start 6 screenings over 3 weeks.
Wow, that's great. So I'll just backtrack a little bit here, just for everybody that's listening to this or going to be watching it. You're Heather, and you have a film company. Red Splat is your company, and you're the producer of Make Me Famous. Just for some background, and Edward Brezinski, this mysterious person, was an alum of San Francisco Art Institute in the late 70s, I understand, which was a few years before my time. I was there from 1982 until 1984. And so from what I've gathered, it's a very interesting story segueing him and the East Village in New York in the 80s. And so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this project, and just a little bit about him. And
Heather and I are both actors. Heather was on Broadway and Wicked for many years, over 10 years actually.
Aha.
And I studied acting at drama at Juilliard. And so I've always been interested in storytelling, as in like creating stories that I can be in. And so I was out of work as an actor, and at that time I was reading a lot about the 1980s art scene. There's a number of great books about that scene, like Cynthia Carr's book Fire in the Belly, about David Wojnarowicz. And so I happened to be working with a fellow waiter named Lenny Kisco, and I talked a little bit about this book I was reading, and he said, well, I all through the 1980s, I invested in one artist, and you should come over to my apartment and look at all these paintings and things that I own. And so I did. And Lenny lives in a railroad apartment, and on every surface is a Brezinski painting.
Oh, wow.
And I was just amazed by the work, but also I loved how Lenny talked about him and how excited he was about him, and about the mystery of Edward Brezinski and like what happened to him. And so Heather came over, she took a look at the art, and we both agreed we'd love to investigate a little bit more. But the only things online about Edward basically was that one of them had to do with an incident in a gallery where Edward had vandalized another artist's artwork, and then that he was in permanent collection in the Brooklyn Museum. And so that's what we had to go with. And so then the only way we could find out would be to go into the community and begin to ask questions about Edward Brezinski. And that's what we did.
Awesome. Very interesting. So it's almost like a detective novel kind of thing, where you're exploring, finding out as you go. And is that how the film, the idea for making a film came about? Was out of that investigating?
Yes. In fact, we thought originally we were making a play.
Aha.
But then it came out that there was this incredible video of poet Miguel Pinero performing at Edward Brezinski's apartment. And so I saw this video and I thought, wow, I'd love to talk to the guy who made this. So I reached out to him. His name is Jim C. And I said, I'm very interested in this video. And he said, well, I have about 100 hours that I filmed with Edward Brezinski. Maybe you'd like to see that. And so once we got a look at this video that had never been seen before, that's when we knew we had a movie instead
Awesome.
of.
That's great. And so through that, did you like contact other people and then talk to other people that might have known him, or just kind of put the pieces together that way? Is that how the making of the film went?
Well, so we started with so Lenny Kisco was kind of a holder of some of his ephemera as well. And one of the things that he had was Edward's resume, his CV. And so we used that as a tool to track down different collectors or schools he went to. And that's how we found SFAI. And in fact, we were able to go to the school and do some research with Jeff Gunderson. He uncovered some photos that Perkle Jones.
Yeah. Perkle Jones. Yeah.
So I guess he photographed each one of his students.
That's correct. Yeah.
Student write their name, or he would write something about the student. Remember them, or maybe you can tell me more about that. But there was a box, and there were two of our artists in there. One was Edward Brezinski, and one was Marcus Leatherdale, who was also a photography student of his.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. Yeah. I wasn't a photo student, and I never met Perkle while I was there, but I have seen some of those photos that he would take a picture of every one of his students and put their name on it. So it's pretty awesome, you know.
We really started at square one when it came to Brezinski, and it was SFAI that was one of the major breakthrough moments for us when we first started. In that Edward Brezinski spelled his name phonetically eventually, because so many people in the press kept mangling the spelling of his real name.
Oh, interesting.
R-Z-E-Z-I-N-S. So when we first began researching him, we didn't really know his last name. And so it was the school that then filled me in on that. And that's when we later, using that, his real name, we located one of his paintings in a museum in New York, and a museum had actually mislabeled his name as well. So,
oh, interesting. So the plot thickens as we go along with that.
And that's exactly the most fun part of this, at least in the beginning, was this book that only you were reading, and the more layers that you would uncover, and you'd realize, oh, wow, this is important what we're doing.
Yeah. Oh, man. It's just so interesting, because there's, like the more you go, the more you find out people that might have known him or known somebody that knew him. And it's just an interesting investigation. So, well, that's great. Yeah.
And we got inspired about what the artist community was doing in New York City in the 80s. Was so different than what is happening now, and maybe could never happen again. A swath of a city, a big city, where people can live cheaply and amongst each other and create art and show art and have poetry readings and gatherings.
Yeah.
Be able to afford to do that bohemian lifestyle.
Yeah. You can just bootstrap something together and make it work.
Now, we spent about 10 years total on the movie, and part of it had to do with not just studying about Edward Brezinski. The first 3 years of researching before we began the filming was getting to know the community that knew. A lot of them are still out there. They're doing their art, and we had to get to know each one of these artists and gallerists was a journey unto itself.
Wow. Yeah.
Meeting an actor, for instance, if you want to say, oh, I'd love to do a play with you and you're an actor, generally an actor will show up at your door the next day.
Interesting.
Breakfast. But that's not how these artists are. You have to earn their trust, and the gallerists were the same way. Like Anina Nosé, who discovered Basquiat. I'd love to talk to you about possibly this artist, Edward Brezinski. And she said, well, I have a wonderful story about Edward, but what do you know?
Okay.
No, it turned out that she taught art history, and she needed me to sort of spell out my thesis, and she assigned me a few books to read before we could talk.
Okay, just a little vetting process there going on. Interesting.
Yeah, but thankfully they did that, though, because the film is more a film about an archetype of an artist trying to make it. So it's not us saying, hey, art world, we think you missed Edward Brezinski. It's not us saying we think Edward Brezinski belongs as the greatest artist in the world. If someone thinks that, that's great. But it's to give you an opportunity to experience the 1980s art scene and the whole scene.
Yeah. Interesting. Because
that's a scene that is often boiled down to Keith Haring, Basquiat, maybe David Wojnarowicz, definitely a little Warhol influence, right?
Right.
But there were hundreds of artists in the East Village that were creating, and so this is a way to look at what that striving was really like, and then when AIDS hit the community, how that impacted them. It's a story that I don't think has been told quite this way before. The bottom looking up, striving for something.
Right.
It is such a relatable story. And I think even if you're not a visual artist, you're an artist of some kind.
Yeah.
You can understand what that striving means.
Exactly. Yeah. Interesting. I'm wondering, do you feel like, just knowing what you know now about him, do you feel like he got what he was after?
I think that, Edward got to live the artist's life, and he was able to commit his life to painting, and though he suffered a lot, he was able to make a lot of really good art and have a lot of rich experiences in his life.
Yeah.
And it's hard to measure a life as unsuccessful when you have that.
Sure. Yeah.
And,
interesting.
Just as a side note, and as far as SFAI goes, there were a number of friends of his that went to SFAI or had friends that went there and were very influenced by it. So we have Scott Covert, and we have Robert Hawkins, for instance, and Marcus Leatherdale, a photographer, brilliant, and Frank Holliday. And
the ladies.
Oh, did I miss one?
Kathy Dumas.
Oh, excuse me, Kathy Dumas, the wonderful photographer.
Awesome.
And Claudia Summers, who became the muse of a lot of artists in the 80s.
Yeah, I'm not forgetting Claudia, but she spent time there. She didn't go to SFAI, but she was among them. But so they learned their craft there at SFAI, and they brought that to New York City, and they changed art history. And so that's why we focus as a lot on people from San Francisco.
Interesting. That's great. Yeah, I just kind of reflect on the scene in New York now, and I wonder if there's any sort of equivalent of that happening nowadays, or if it's even possible in a 2023 kind of way. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Little artist enclaves still in Brooklyn that are happening, but I don't know that it could be just like blocks and blocks of city.
Yeah.
I went to Detroit recently because Edward grew up in Detroit. And I thought, well, gosh, wouldn't that be an interesting way to revive that city where there's lots of abandoned buildings? And I wish that maybe I'll call the mayor, just take a look at Making Famous, see if we can't revive Detroit and give the artists a place to have that kind of lifestyle.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It's an interesting note, that a point that Heather's making there. I think it was around the 1980s. People like artists like Keith Haring and Richard Hambleton, and Basquiat, where they went out onto the street and they transformed an urban landscape. And then, of course, what happened after that? Then people wanted to live there again. They brought people in. And so Edward was in this unique position that everyone was in that was from that time period, and that they had rent that was so cheap to live in New York City, they could pay their rent off in a day of working as a waiter.
Oh, man.
All live out this bohemian fantasy, and they could perform for each other. And as Eric Bogosian says in the movie, it became about who could be the most creative, right? And those were the ones that were lifted up to the top. They celebrated each other and they performed for each other.
Awesome.
And so the only way to have a community like that again, I think, is to find some kind of egalitarian rent, so that it's not, art isn't just made by rich people's kids.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I know when I was going to the Art Institute in the 80s, the whole south of Market area, it was a little bit like no man's land down there, and it's not that anymore. it's quite modernized, and there's some big buildings down there, and I think there were some graduate studios in warehouses, and I've talked to a few students from the 70s, and they had pretty cheap living spaces or studio spaces down there, and it's interesting to kind of reflect on that and how things change, and what's happening now to kind of facilitate people's studios and creative activities, and where they're doing it, and what's happening. So
sure. And there's one element too there that I think is required for great art to happen, and that you have to there has to be something dangerous about your environment, I think.
Interesting.
You bring that into the work, I mean, of course, there was AIDS then, and every artwork could be their last, and they didn't even know how you contacted it, and all their friends were dying. So there was an intensity from an urgency from this time period that I think is required to make great art.
Interesting. Yeah. Tell me something else that you've learned about him and the whole art scene in New York in the 80s then.
We went out into the community and we got to know all the, as many people as we could that were still alive from that time period. And then we researched the people that had died. And so this movie tries to make an entire feature film with the artwork, the photography, the video, and the input of the people who lived the scene. And also, where there's not video of Edward to help tell the story, there's original art that's been made for the film. And it's made by the people who loved Edward and knew him. And I think that adds a really interesting angle to it, but it also means that what you're watching is not just about art history, but you're visually seeing something new, and you're becoming familiar with artwork that you've never seen before, i.e. Edwards, but also others like Kathy Dumas, who was a very talented photographer. MoMA just recently included her in a very big way at the Club 57 show. And her photographs, her family has generously allowed us to use, and it helps tell the story. But it does more than that, because Kathy's work is so outstanding, and she was close with Edward, that it gives you a brand new artist to appreciate. And anytime that we could do that with this movie, we did, because we felt like this was a movie that was about archetypes. Ultimately. And some of these artists, their careers had, over 10 years that we filmed this. So some of the artists, when we started, their career, they didn't think was going very well. And then by the time we finished, some of them were, doing very, very well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So that's great. So it's like a real time continuum. You're not just making a film about something that happened, but you're actually exploring and discovering and making, a real-time documentation of things.
It gives you a viewpoint of how a real life of an artist is when you take this long on something, because you get the way that every career and every life works basically is like a shore. The water comes in and it comes out too.
Right. Interesting.
It really is a time capsule of art. We got about 650 images of photographs of artworks, and most of those are from the East Village artists.
Awesome.
And so it's almost like they're helping tell the story through their art. And so inadvertently, it's like a museum's worth of artwork, but you get to sit in a cushy seat and eat your popcorn and watch the film.
Great. That's great. That's awesome. Do you think that they're, in terms of being actors, is it similar, like in terms of the just kind of reflecting back on artists that visual artists that had warehouses for studios and kind of bootstrapped galleries together, is it similar from your perspective as an actor in terms of the lifestyle and activities that
I get what you're saying. It is very similar. When I first moved to New York, and you go to New York from somewhere else, most people congregate there, and especially as actors, Broadway is there and most of the auditions are there, and so you try to, the thing is, keep the rent as low as possible, which usually means lots of roommates, or you live way out, 2 buses and a train away, and you have a survival job so that you can have a job maybe you don't love, but that at least gets enough money in the coffers so that you can create your art, or in our case, go to your auditions and try to get in the next play or music. So it really is somewhat similar in that way. That, but the difference in my mind for actors is we're waiting for someone to bring us a project, a script, or auditioning for something. What is so unique about visual artists is they can wake up every day and they can make something.
Right.
And it's theirs. And they can be creative and free right from the get-go. I have to be creative and somewhat free, but with someone else's work, So it is, to me, it's very inspiring and something limitless that I don't personally understand because I'm not a visual artist, but I sure can put myself in that same, mindset, especially because when I was in Wicked, I was in it for a long time, and it took me a while to get onto Broadway, and most people don't just audition for one thing and get right on Broadway.
Sure.
And I had lots of friends who were so talented, right? And they may never, ever get to Broadway. So why do some people make it and some people don't? And so for me, in this film, it was so interesting to think, well, why did this artist make it and Edward didn't? And why did that artist make it? And why wasn't Kathy Dumas like the most famous photographer? Because look at her work, So I think that was a fun thing for us to kind of delve into when we were making this project.
Yeah, no, that's great. I totally appreciate that whole idea, because in some ways it seems almost random sometimes, or just a matter of circumstance. Like you had coffee with the right person and bam, the next thing you know.
When it comes to actors, and I think even now, having researched and done this movie, similar to artists, what people don't know, I think, when they first finish school and stuff, when they're coming out as a young artist, maybe in their 20s or late teens or early 30s, this is it. You need to make it now. If you don't make it now, what happens is the people that do make it, there's a whole team of people that then start to support just that one person. And then their livelihoods depend on that one person making it. Yeah. So now there's less room for everyone else. And that's how that pyramid begins. And so you really see that if you go back and you really take a look at the art history of, you know, the gallerists, once they choose this artist, and once the art critic, those are the most important elements, the art critic and the gallery, and then the artist is now lifted up by multiple people. They're not just one person walking around going, help me, help me. And then there's a team of people going, we need to work on this guy, so we don't have time for you.
Yeah.
There's a sense of urgency that I would say, having looked at this, the art history, that there's a sense of urgency that you need to have, and you need to keep, and you need to say, I need to get this to the right people. I need to get an art critic working on this. I need to get a gallerist inspired by me, and I need to get going right now. Because the longer that you take, the more difficult it gets, and all that stuff. So that sense of urgency is really important to success.
Yeah, right. That's great. Well, this has been great talking to you. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, specifically about the film or the upcoming screenings or anything.
Yeah, I'd like to just say that our film Make Me Famous, which is about to play at 4-Star starting on Thursday. It's a movie that we made so that when people came to see it as a group, then they might find it even more rewarding than if they waited to see it later. First of all, the art is more beautiful when it's amplified on a giant screen. But Heather and I are both actors, and so we've designed this film as almost sort of you might play structure, act 1, act 2, act 3, and but there's humor in it. And I think that, you know, having seen many people seeing it in the theaters, that it's just very exciting to come in person, and we hope you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is great. I really appreciate getting in here and doing this a little bit on the fly, but you know, it's all good, and I hope it's successful. I hope a lot of people. It looks like you've done a lot of good work with social media to let people know what's happening, and you know, I hope that you have a lot of success with this. It's just very, very cool.
If you want to kind of check out our social media, it is a really wonderful space. I started the social media stuff during the pandemic, and I personally was not a fan of social media. And kind of started learning to look at it in a different way, where it was supposed to be social. So you make something to attract the kind of people you want to talk to, you want to be around. And, for us, it was artists, and maybe artists that enjoy, you know, kind of being nostalgic and, you know, touching base with each other. And so generally our social media will kind of take a look at different aspects of the 80s. We are on Instagram and Facebook, Make Me Famous Movie, all one word.
Yeah.
And especially on Instagram, we really delve into like perhaps other artists maybe that aren't in the film that are forgotten. And we definitely kind of highlight the people in the film that tell the story. And so, you know, join us in our reminiscing of the 80s. And then also, you know, we would just really love for every art lover to come and see the film in San Francisco. We're playing kind of a non-traditional run, which means we're not playing 3 times a day for a week. We're playing maybe 6 screenings over 2 weeks. So we play until November 3rd, which allows for you to kind of find a day in your schedule that you can come. And honestly, it meant a lot to us to try to get this in cinemas in front of people. And because this is a documentation of a time before the internet, before cell phones, before social media. And what the artists did that was so special is got together, and they had poetry and they had art shows, and one person would have an art show and these 5 people would be in it. And then one of those people would, and they would just be creating all the time, having community. And so to do this in the cinema is another way for you to have community and be enveloped into this era.
Awesome. Awesome.
And so it's important for us to try to get the word out. So we thank you so much for helping us get in front of the SFA alumni.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Thomas. And we've been playing for 4 months in New York in 2 theaters, and we also played Toronto and London. So there's a whole lot of interest in this SFAI painter.
That's great. What's that? I'm sorry.
There'll be more screenings to come.
Oh, okay. That's great.
You can drop our website in the chat or in the liner notes. It's Make Me Think.
Make Me Think. That's
great.
And we
update it and put all the new places. We just played in Barcelona. We're playing in Oslo. We're playing in Albuquerque upcoming.
Cool.
Yeah, there's some really fun things on the horizon.
That's awesome. Well, very good. I really appreciate it. It's nice to meet you both, at least on the screen here, and maybe someday in person. That's always good. And I wish you all the best, and appreciate your being here for a little while this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome. You've been listening to Speaking of Art School, an oral history project created to perpetuate the culture and legacy of the San Francisco Art Institute. I'm your host, Thomas M. Houston. If you're an alumni of SFAI and would like to participate in this project, please contact me at thomasmhoustonartist@gmail.com. Please stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and as always, thanks for listening.